Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joe Swimmer. I'm the Executive Director of the Episcopal Parish Network, and welcome to this last for September digital workshop, aka webinar from EPN, and our friends at St. Andrews in the Heights and CCS Fundraising. We are thrilled to have our panelists, Luke and Jimmy, joining us today to talk about fundraising in a time after COVID or in the new phase of COVID, or however we might be framing it these days. But what are we doing around capital campaigns as we move into this next phase of being after the depths of the pandemic a couple of years ago? We're thrilled to have you with us. We are glad that we have these two terrific panelists, and we want you to know that we will be sending a recording of this along with the PowerPoint that will be used out to everyone who registered. It will also be available on our website. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Luke from CCS and look forward to a terrific conversation. Thanks so much.
Great. Thanks, Joe, and thanks everybody for joining us today. Love working with Joe Swimmer and everybody at EPN. They really put together wonderful content. The annual conference, I go to a lot of conferences, as you might expect, working with our fundraising firm, but the EPN conference is one of the better conferences in terms of content and the people that come to it. And it's going to be in Jimmy's hometown next year. So it's going to be in Houston. So do yourself a favor and book your trip to H-Town soon, because it is worth the trip, not only for the town as well as for the conference. Joined by Jimmy Grace here. Jimmy is the rector at St. Andrews in the Heights in Houston. We were very fortunate to work with Jimmy and his volunteer leadership on doing a campaign. And today we want to just talk about a couple things. Just want to go over a little bit about campaign fundamentals, talk about some of the lessons that we learned specifically doing the campaign. That we were Jimmy and his folks were doing a lot of the planning, sort of just coming out of that time where people were starting to come back and worshiping more in person, but it was still sort of early days when we did that. And then we'll do some Q&A. And as Joe said, let's use the chat feature. So it's also helpful if you type in your name and where you're from, what church you're with as well. That would be great to put that in the chat just to kind of have that flowing. And then also any questions. So we'll try to make sure we keep an eye on that regularly. Just kind of skipping ahead to campaign fundamentals. I talked to you a little bit about the two of us. I'm one of the partners at CCS, and Jimmy's at St. Andrews, we talked about. So a little bit about CCS. We have about 350 fundraising staff and probably close to about 500 staff altogether. So we're international, headquartered in New York. We work with about 600, 700 nonprofits across the different, really all the whole nonprofit spectrum. Worked in the Episcopal sector for probably getting close to, it says 42 years, but I think that might even be even longer, getting close to 50 years working in that space. And so really I've done a lot of work in the sort of parish and congregation-based space, which is really the most fun, I think, for me, because it is the most community-based fundraising that you can do. We also have a kind of dedicated Episcopal content cabinet, so we're always trying to look to see what kind of information everybody wants and needs, and that's free for you guys to have, but we always want to bring people together to have conversations. One thing that we just would encourage as we folks, I appreciate folks typing in where they're from in the chat, but maybe talk a little bit about maybe a little word or a couple phrases that describes your fundraising, for this year. What is it looking like? We're kind of a lot of folks are getting geared up, for stewardship, probably in the next 2 months or so. So just would be eager to kind of hear what your thoughts are, how this year has gone, and maybe what your outlook is for the coming year. I see untapped there. That's a good one. I like that. Always a chance to grow and get more significant. And as these pop in, I see transition and redevelop. Yep, sometimes we need to retool. That's always important. Challenging, absolutely. growing. These are all good. Why these are popping in, some of the things I've seen in a few other congregations is as the congregation has aged, sometimes there's a handful of older donors who are, again, some of maybe your founding parishioners or longtime parishioners who are, make up maybe a disproportionate amount of sort of your annual giving budget. So it's always important to make sure we're challenging folks who are at the middle and the lower end to kind of elevate their giving, because it's awfully tough to replace, if you have a donor who's giving you $30,000, $40,000 a year, to replace that, it's going to take a lot of folks who are giving, a couple thousand a year to do that. Another aspect that we kind of heard from a lot of folks too is in the past year or two is a lot of increased focus on kind of estate giving and plan giving and how folks can give. So I'm seeing lots of little things popping up here. This is all good. Maybe if we could, Caitlin, move to the next slide, and we'll kind of go through a little bit about the philanthropic landscape. So there's a document called Giving USA. It's a report that comes out every year. It comes out in about June or so of each year. So it's always a look back at the previous year. So when you kind of get the 2023 report, it's a look back in June of this year. It's a look back at the calendar year of 2022 in giving. And there's always a few gifts and things that still come in the first part of the year. So they kind of usually take a little time to put it together. So this past year's report, when we looked at it, the total giving, and this is from individuals, it's from companies, it's from foundations, it's from estates as well. The total giving was just a little bit shy of 500 billion, which is just a phenomenal thing when you think about it. A billion with a B, so $500 billion that was given, in a documented way in terms of charitable giving. One of the things we have seen across the board at pretty much across all different denominations is the attendance hasn't yet fully recovered to pre-pandemic levels. Some of that also what's happened is some folks have become part of an online community where maybe there wasn't one before. That's now become a fixed group that's how they want to meet with you. And then the other thing that we have seen across the board in the past year is we saw the number of individual donors has gone down across really all nonprofits, not just necessarily in the faith-based space. Now, when we look at where the giving goes to, even though the country has become more secular over the past 30, 40 years, still by far religion is the leading source of where people will make their gifts. They give to their church, they give to their synagogues. That's usually the most important. When I started in this space almost, I think, 32 years ago now. That number, when I first started probably 30 years ago, was probably closer to like 35% in terms of all the dollars given. And then there's a fairly even spread to different types of things. So, human services, that's, it's going to be your food banks and things of that nature. Education, that's both higher education as well as K through 12. One of the rising things we've also seen is giving to foundations. So with the kind of rise of some of the folks with really high net worth, a lot of them are giving and establishing their own foundations or donating, again, making gifts, large gifts, particularly with the giving pledge that came out with Bill Gates and other folks who were some of these folks who had really significant wealth, where a lot of them are giving their own assets away during their lifetimes, and sometimes to their own foundations, or also through things like donor advised funds. But you can see the spread of all the different things, but still religion is by far the number one place. So some things to remember about capital campaign fundamentals, the things that are sort of keys to success. These four things are really the same, whether you're raising money for, a cathedral or a small little church in the country. It's the same consistent things. So it's the case. So what are we raising money for and why? Why is there a sense of urgency around it? Who's it going to, benefit and impact? Leadership, who are we going to get within the congregation to lead the effort? That certainly having the clergy involved in a visible way is important, but it's always important to have lots of volunteer leadership that people know and respect. And a lot of times in a campaign, because it's got a relatively short window of time that it operates, it's also a chance to kind of sometimes get new leadership involved. When you're serving on the vestry, that's a pretty big responsibility, and it's a little more intense in terms of its meeting cadence. Whereas a campaign might only be for, a few months or a few weeks, depending on the size of it. So sometimes it's a chance to get new volunteers involved. Prospects, obviously, who are we going to ask and how much we're going to ask is very important to figure that out in a thoughtful way. And then the last part that's sort of vital to this is the plan. So the plan has to be sort of tailored. It has all the best practices and the things that traditionally work, but also sort of understands local conditions and sort of what works best for people. In terms of when you're looking to set the goal, and this is something that Jimmy and I will talk about in a little bit, is, when we looked at setting the campaign goal at his congregation, we were sort of looking at a number of different things. So one, we kind of looked at did some research and analysis of sort of recent giving, looking at giving over the past couple of years leading up to that point, our sense of what things were, and where the gifts were likely to come from. Now, it's always important, you see on the right there, that the goal should be challenging, meaning it should be aspirational. So it should be something, hopefully, that is significant enough that that's why you're doing a campaign versus just increasing the annual giving. But it needs to be achievable. So we always sort of caution folks that you never want to sort of set a goal that's somewhat open-ended to say, well, our needs are this much and we're going to raise as much as we can. Well, everyone knows, yeah, we're going to obviously do our best and raise as much as we can, but we want people also to feel good about what we've done. And that kind of goes in the bottom left there. It's not always about, it is about the need, about what we're doing, but not just that alone. So there's a psychology to it that we want people to stretch and feel like their gift makes a difference, because one of the number one reasons when you ask people, why do you give to something, or why do you give a more substantial gift to something? They say, because I want to make an impact. I want to make a difference. So, that when you look at that and you're sort of shaping that, when you're looking at where is the giving going to come from, it shouldn't be wholly dependent on sort of just, one, lead gift or one, a selection of folks. And you can't make assumptions either, because sometimes what can happen is you could have a case of whoever that lead donor might be. Maybe they're in a situation where at the moment they can't consider a gift because of whatever the circumstances might be. So you have to make sure that you're setting a goal that is going to be something that people feel like you're going to make a difference. It's a clear target. We can get there and we can do some specific things afterward when we're successful. In terms of some of the campaign materials, there's lots of different things you need to do during a campaign. So we need to have some type of case for support, or eventually that can be turned into a brochure, but what are we raising funds for? Why does it need to be fixed, repaired, replaced, or built from scratch? We need to kind of move those things into different types of brochures and newsletters and flyers. We also can do some website content and messaging, like we did some after we were going to be conducting a study. I know Jimmy did kind of a video message that was shared out with everybody in the congregation, letting them know, we're going to be conducting a study in the coming weeks. So, when you hear from us, please, take our call. We want to make sure we think ahead and that we answer all the questions that folks have. And this is a good, for folks working as volunteers of the leadership of it, it's always important to think about, okay, what people might ask, because sometimes that forces us to think about some things we might need to do, or might need to have, need to take some steps to address. The materials and things for the volunteers are important. We want to have, where it's appropriate and tasteful, donor recognition in terms of we want to thank everybody that's given, be appreciative of that. In terms of request letters and pledge forms, we also want to make sure we document everything. So it's very clear that if the Driscolls or the Graces made a gift, that we've thanked them for that, we've documented, and the staff at the parish is making sure to send people reminders during the campaign. And then lastly, campaign communications, and Jimmy can talk a little bit about this too, about what they're doing to let people know, thank you for continuing to pay your pledges, but also here's some of the things that we're doing with the funds that you've given us that we're collecting right now. So all these things are all this different things are important to have, and things that we worked on specifically with his congregation. So let's talk a little bit about this, and maybe Jamie, I'm going to turn it to you to maybe talk a little bit. Maybe you could take a minute. Folks can look at this screen, but maybe you could just, in your own words, describe kind of your congregation, what it's like, and maybe during your time being there. So maybe kind of a little short snippet from you.
Sure, happy to do that. Thank you, Luke, and good afternoon, everybody. I've served as rector of St. Andrews here in Houston for almost 10 years, about 9.5 years, and the capital campaign that we conducted in 2022 last year was the first campaign I've ever conducted as a rector, first campaign I've ever conducted, period. And the first capital campaign this church has conducted in really the last 10 to 15 years. So as you might imagine, the church buildings were built in the 40s, and so a lot of the buildings were in need of some refreshment, as well as some structural improvements, as well as just a growing list. In my time as rector here, there's a growing list of projects that needed to be done that we just didn't have the resources to do, and so that's what really became the genesis for our hope, our vision, our legacy campaign at St. Andrews. And as you can see on the slide, the biggest piece of that was replacing our aging church organ. And then another big part of it is also replacing a lot of our air conditioning units. So the exciting thing about that on the implementation side of it is to see all of those projects now happening, which I can get into and talk a little bit more too. But as far as the dynamics of St. Andrews, we are a church. Our average Sunday attendance right now is about 150. To Luke's point earlier, our attendance has not yet returned to what it was pre-pandemic. Pre-pandemic, we were almost at about 200. But our giving is increasing year to year to year. And so our annual giving through our stewardship is increasing, and our budget is growing. So, and people are slowly trickling back, but we just noticed that it's taking time for all of us. So when I proposed to the vestry that we consider a capital campaign, it was under the auspice that we would work with a consultant. And once we secured CCS to be our consultant to help us with our campaign, they did. They came in and at the beginning of last year did the feasibility study, which was really important for us and for our parishioners, and also likewise for CCS, to determine level of interest and level of capacity to give. And so we, as you can see on the slide, it was determined that we could have an achievable goal would be 2 million would be achievable for our congregation based on the results from the feasibility study. And we were able to raise a little over that, 2.5 over about a 4-month period, which was wonderful, because the goal was, and we had a lot of deliberations internally. Should we do 2 million or should we do 2.5? And we really landed on the 2 million mark because like I said, we have not done a campaign of this size ever in the 100-year plus history of this congregation. They've never done that. So that was really important for us to do.
That's super helpful, Jimmy. And yeah, that was, I remember when we did the study, it was sort of right after we kind of did the planning at the end of 2021. It was sort of, I think we had a series of meetings with the vestry, and we had to kind of go ahead in early December. And then we kind of had to hit the ground running on sort of the 3rd or 4th of January, kind of getting started. And we talk about, even though it seems, this doesn't seem like it was that long ago, really. It was probably less than 18 months ago. But even back then, my coworker who was coming out, she had been exposed to she had a family gathering at the holidays, and somebody had COVID, and she couldn't get a COVID test back then. So it wasn't even like, now it seems like, folks like, oh, I'll take a COVID test, in case I have it or something. But it was, even then, you couldn't even get the tests, and when you couldn't get them done quickly. So I just told her, I said, stay home. I'm already out here. And I said, the last thing we want to do to these nice people is have you come out here and get folks sick, just in case that was. So we did have a few of those kind of instances, during the process, where we were going to go see some folks, where it got delayed for a few weeks because that still was something that was happening. But the study was really important also, just to get a sense from people, coming out of this, as they were kind of getting re-engaged. Did they understand the need for these things? And Jimmy, maybe you could speak to that for a minute, in terms of, there was a number of different things around the property, the buildings, there's a church building, and there's also a parish house. But maybe you could talk about how well people understood, for example, the organ, or some of the ways that we sort of explained to people why that was needed.
Sure. One of the things I'll say, Luke, is that it was very educational for the congregation just doing the feasibility study, because there were some members of the congregation who thought, for example, that the diocese financially supported the parish, and we told them, that's not the arrangement is actually the opposite of that. That the parishes send an assessment to the diocese, and so it was just real educational for them to understand that our funding sources primarily come from, at this parish, from since we do not yet have an endowment, come from the pledges that people make. It was also important, coming out of the pandemic, there was a lot of conversation at the vestry level and at the finance committee level. Is this the right time? There was a lot of volatility, I believe, in the market at the time, and coming out of COVID, all of the uncertainty with that. Ultimately, where the finance and vestry landed after a lot of conversation was that there's never going to be an ideal moment to do a capital campaign, and that if we were to wait for the perfect scenario in which to begin a capital campaign for the parish, that day would never come. And so we really stepped out in faith, trusting that we were in good hands with CCS and with our parish, and through our discernment. And so we really use this as an opportunity to educate the parish about the issues that we're having with our aging organ, which was costing us more money year over year to maintain. The issues pertaining to our buildings that deal with HVAC systems that are not at a high capacity, and that are costing us more money to maintain, and that are not very economical, and all of those things. To really be able to share all of that with the parish was really helpful for them and for us to be real clear and transparent, and really what I think made one of the things that made the campaign very successful was our transparency with the congregation, and telling them, that we have things like, we have an organ that's parts of it are over 100 years old, and they don't make parts for it anymore, and the technology is extremely dated, and are some of the things that aren't really interesting, but in a place like Houston are critical, like air conditioning. Air conditioning is something you don't think about as long as it's working well, but when it stops working, and 2 of our units this year failed, which we've subsequently replaced as a result of having raised the funds from the campaign, you notice it real quickly. And so just to be able to have all of that information, to be able to present to the parish as part of our case statement, to go before our members, to say, this is why we want to, this is what we're raising the money for. And we consolidated all of that. And this is the last thing I'll say. We consolidated it into a one-page dashboard where we had 3 buckets, if you will, the 3 areas of the campaign that we were wanting to raise money for. Number 1, the interior space of the congregation, the interior space of the church building, and the interior space of the church office area. Second, the organ, replacing the organ, which I spoke to earlier. And then the third piece of the campaign was our exterior space, and re-landscaping the exterior part of the church to make it more welcoming for the community. And we the one thing that we ran into with the congregation with some members and some, it was different schools of thought on how we should come at all of this information. And so there are some people who said, we want to know precise numbers for what it's going to cost to replace the organ, or we want to know the precise number for what it's going to cost to replace all these windows. And we got pretty close estimates to that, but it's also not something that we found we could realistically say, based on these bids, this is exactly what it's going to cost, and that we're raising money that we think will cover all of these projects, but we can't give exact numbers, even though there were some of our parishioners that asked for that, and we weren't able to provide it for them, but we could say, we could provide them a good faith estimate, which has actually, since we've now moved into the implementation part of the campaign, the work that we're doing is actually coming in under what the estimates of the cost estimates were in the beginning.
We're going to put some money and seed money into that endowment yet, James.
That's right. That's right.
Just maybe flip to the next slide. Caitlin talks in terms of the campaign. We talked about this. So at the end of all this hard work, we had, about 110 gifts, from families. Everybody on the staff, was generous and raised a little, just, shy of 2.6 million in pledges. The cases, as Jimmy said, was very clear and compelling. And the volunteers did a really nice job, educating people what we did. We did a series also of receptions where we brought folks into small groups as well as visits. And we were very good about with a kind of campaign timeline, moving it along and doing it in the spring. And as Jimmy talked about, it gets real hot in the summertime. So you really need to kind of wrap the campaign up before you get too deep into the late spring, because it turns into summer quickly in Texas. And then people, will go here, there, and everywhere. And I think overall, as Jimmy said too, it sort of helped create a new culture of philanthropy at St. Andrews. And there were a number of questions in the chat that we'll dive into a little bit, that some folks had. But I think the campaign, was very successful in terms of engaging people, talking to people, the volunteers feeling comfortable to go out and share what we were doing. And one of the things that we always sort of stressed is we don't mind if somebody says no, but we want to make sure it's an informed and an educated no. And really that we saw a lot of folks were very happy to give and to support what we were doing. All the things that we did here are completely scalable. You can do this for, a huge cathedral church, and you can do this for a mission church too. So, I think one of the questions where somebody had asked in the chat was, what can we do if we're a small mission church, and that, we might be only, it's a small number. Like anything else, it's talking to people, as Jimmy talked about, connecting with people, being transparent about the need. Also, sometimes what can happen is, in a smaller community, you can engage people to say, it's just us. we need to step up and step forward and doing this. So some of it is kind of giving people the chance to be accountable to do these different things. And then there were a couple questions that came in the chat. I'll kind of cover one or two. And Jimmy, there are a couple that asked you about kind of your annual giving. I'll and your numbers. I'll just address one other quick question, which I think happened twice, was, is there any kind of formula to setting a campaign goal? Now, it used to be that you could have a range of anywhere to sort of 2 to 4 times the annual giving was a good yardstick to use. Because we've seen sort of somewhat dwindling numbers, and sometimes some of the aging parishioners are giving up at a higher level, where they're older and maybe don't have the ability to make a significant gift. So unless you're doing estate gifts as part of that campaign, now somewhere in that 2 to 3 range, and the difference always X factor is, do you have families who could make some significant gifts? And in Jimmy's case, we did have a couple families who stepped forward and made some really wonderful gifts that propelled us even further. But if we didn't have those, we still would have made the goal, but we wouldn't have gone as much over it as we did. So Jimmy, in the chat, I know some folks asked a little bit about your annual giving and your numbers. I think you might have mentioned it a little bit at the outset of your introductions, but maybe you could touch on that again for everybody.
Sure, happy to do that. The other thing that was really helpful for the congregation was to do education around a capital campaign versus a stewardship campaign, and that one does not eliminate the other, and that we do both. And so for our stewardship annual giving last year, our goal was $775,000, and we raised $798,000 on that, and that was over. I can tell you how many pledges that was. That was 137 pledges last year. This year, for 2024, our goal is slightly higher, not much, but slightly higher, $815,000. And we start our stewardship campaign Sunday, actually, at St. Andrews. But the really important part that I really underline with my vestry here is to have all vestry members submit their pledges to our stewardship campaign before the stewardship campaign goes live, so that we have 100% vestry participation, which is also what we did with the capital campaign, because when we announced the capital campaign, which was not a surprise to the congregation, we were able to say, you know, we're doing this capital campaign. Our goal is $2 million. We already have this many people have already pledged, and we have already raised, you know, $200,000 towards our goal, or something like that, to let the parish know that we're well on our way. Actually, it was higher than that, because we did a lot of the work quietly in the quiet phase of the campaign, where we did a lot of our initial asks. So by the time we went public with the congregation that we were doing the capital campaign, I think had, Luke, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we had somewhere between, we were 70 to 75% to our goal.
Yeah, I think we were just a little bit over 70%.
Yeah, which makes it much more feasible and digestible for the congregation to hear, oh my gosh, $2 million, are you crazy? Oh wait, we've already raised 1.75. Okay, well we can fill the gap on that. So, but it is, we did look at our annual giving as a key indicator of what we would be able to achieve on the capital giving side.
And really, the annual giving is a good barometer to look at. And the thing you have to, then go a little deeper is, because that's just numbers on a page, because you can have two families and one's giving you, $3,000 a year and the other's giving you $3,000 a year. And you look at one, and that person's a retired school teacher, they're single, they're retired, they're on their own. And then somebody else, in Houston, it's a big oil, gas, and financial services community. So you could have somebody else who's also giving you $3,000, but that person could be making, mid six figures annually, but they're under giving. So you can't always necessarily look completely just at numbers alone, because in those two situations, the one person is stretching to make that commitment. The other person, again, they're being generous, but they could be stretched to do more. And I think that goes back to, with annual giving, is how do you encourage those folks to understand how their gift and their giving can make an impact? So, and a lot of that is just, it's personal, it's connecting to people. We all have our own finances to take care of, so in some ways, Jimmy's got two large buildings and a big parking lot and a decent size kind of hardscape campus there. Kind of their church sits on the end of, 3 blocks, one big block. It's got on 3 sides. So it's a very visible place. So you really have to take good care of it to be, good with the neighbors, but it's a lot of work to do too. So it's making people to understand they have their own homes. They want to take care of their own homes and they want them to look good. The church should do the same thing. It should be part of the neighborhood. It should look cared for. It doesn't necessarily need to be extravagant, but you need to do those types of things. So I think you can kind of get them to understand why that's necessary and why these things are important. And as Jimmy talked about, churches don't do these types of large scale projects, but every, maybe decade or so that they do something of this scale. And in this case, it was 2 decades. So they were long past due. But what's nice is, We gave people a 5-year window to pay their pledges over, and we were very clear to say this was over and above what they were giving to their annual gift. What we find at CCS is that most of our campaigns, when we circle back and talk to folks to see how the funds are being collected, in most cases we see the vast majority of the money, the cash that's coming in actually comes in about 3.5 years. It's kind of a human nature thing. You make a pledge at the beginning, you're trying to figure out in your finances how to do it. So doing something spread over 5 years seems to make it a little easier for people to think about. But a lot as they start paying it, they then say, hey, I have some additional funds. I'm going to give more. I'm going to start to pay this off, especially when you're doing some capital related projects, because you can only do the projects that you have the cash for. So people realize, oh, if we have another, $100,000, they can do the hardscaping or they can fix the roof. I'm going to pay off my pledge to help them get there. So that's the kind of thing that we do find, even though you give people the window of time to do it over, they tend to expedite it. And I think the reason why that's important to do, it also gives the donors some flexibility, particularly your larger donors. Some of those folks who have more resources, they're also probably being asked by multiple sources to support different things. Colleges might be asking, hospitals, all different types. It just gives them a little more flexibility to make their gift. We did see a couple other questions too about, how can you help annual giving? Maybe I'll make a comment on that, and maybe Jimmy, you could kind of talk about your experiences. But I think a lot about annual giving, getting people to increase it is again having, stewardship be something that doesn't just show up once a year in October or November. It really has to be happening throughout the year, and that you're doing it in different ways to thank people. So it doesn't feel like you're always raising money all year round, but it's that responsibility. This is our church home. So just like our homes, we need to take care of our church home. And so people should be happy to do it, should feel good about it. So that's an important thing. And I think, doing those types of communications and having people, volunteers also sort of talking to their fellow peers versus it coming from Jimmy or other clergy members, is also important. Jimmy, maybe you could talk about your experiences in terms of the kind of annual giving, what you've seen that's worked at St. Andrews.
Sure. I just want to preface that by saying, and this wasn't asked, but just in transparency, what have our receipts been on the capital campaign? So we concluded the campaign in June of 2022, and we now in September of 2023, we're over $1 million in terms of funds received. So that's probably about 40% of the corpus that was pledged. So we're really incentivized by that, and the response has been really good from the parish. On the annual giving side, a couple things that I do is, first of all, I determine with my finance committee what our pledge goal should be for the coming year's campaign. And that takes a while to do because we do a preliminary budget to determine what our needs are going to be for next year. And so we did that this year and came up with that we would need $850,000 for our pledge goal to cover our ministry related expenses for 2024. We did that work earlier this year. And so to be able to begin communicating that at the vestry level, and then once we communicate that to the vestry, to the parish as a whole, we'll be communicating that it's a 5% increase in pledge amount over last year. If you look at the total amount, and the way that I'm going to be communicating that is, and have communicated it to the congregation, is to say that we personally, my family, we increased our pledge 5% to cover the increase in costs, and we're asking the congregation to do that. So far, the congregation has responded every year to increases related to our budget, and so I'm hopeful that trend continues this year, but we can't. I don't have the crystal ball. But that has worked. They appreciate honesty and transparency. from me and from the staff. And so we try to present in as distilled way as possible what our budget will look like for next year. Although it's a little hard to do that because the vestry won't approve our budget for next year until December. So, but we do the best that we can, present as much detail as we can to the congregation so that they know what they're giving their hard-earned dollars for, and that has really helped. The last thing I'll say is I do ask people to speak in church during the 6 weeks of our stewardship campaign, and I asked them in May actually to speak. So I asked them 5 months in advance, to really, so they have plenty of time to think about it, and it's on their radar. So those things have been working for us. We are also this year, the one thing we're doing this year that we haven't done yet, so I don't know if it will work or not, but during the weeks of our stewardship campaign, we will be putting, we're mailing out all of the pledge information and all the brochures and all that, but we're also putting pledge cards inside every bulletin that we hand out to people on Sundays during our stewardship campaign.
That's great, Jimmy. And there is something to, the empathy from the speakers. And it's just like when you have campaign volunteers, if they've, and vestry members too, if they've stretched to make a meaningful gift, they then can say to somebody with empathy, like, I went through the same process. I had to think about my giving. And I know, like most of us, I'm the same way in terms of giving to things. It's only till it's brought to my attention that I actually think about how much I'm giving to something and maybe how much I might be spending on other things, and so it's one of those things where like, oh, I could do more. I think most people get to that jump on their own relatively quickly. So you should never feel that you're bothering anybody. Again, this is a shared community that we're here. Just a couple rapid fire. There were some questions here in the that folks had. Should you do a campaign if your annual pledging has decreased? I think you should do a campaign, not just for the sake of doing a campaign, but you should do a campaign, based on, are there a combination of needs that can't be addressed through the budget or can't be addressed through the budget in a short window of time. So if your giving is going down, is it going down because it's more just the size of the congregation is getting a bit smaller, or is it going down for other reasons? Sometimes what happens at some places, people tell the congregation, we're going to fix up the hall. And then they get all the bids in, they're more expensive. And they go, we're going to pave the parking lot instead. Now that's fine if everybody takes part in that discussion. If you find that, oh, well, the cost of, this building was going to be steel and the cost of steel went through the roof right now. So the project's going to cost us 3 times more than we thought. We think the vestry's talked about, we propose this. We'd love everybody to weigh in and let us know. If you don't feel the same, we can take your gift and give it back to you. You can take your gift and we can redirect it. But what often happens is a small group of folks just decide this is what we're going to do. And trust is so important in philanthropy. People need to trust that. You've heard Jimmy say, and I don't know if you've even heard himself saying it, like, hey, it's a good faith effort. We're going to do the best we can do. We're going to be very forthright. And I think people appreciate that. So I think, if giving is down and things like that, but you have significant needs, I wouldn't shy away from doing a campaign if it's something that's important to the congregation. But even doing a study or a survey to make sure everybody's on the same page is also a good thing to do that. A couple other questions. Somebody was saying, how often can you do a campaign? I know Jimmy wasn't lining up to do another campaign right after this one was over. But typically, you don't do back-to-back campaigns, meaning you do a campaign, then do another, 3 years or 5 years, unless you're doing something really big. Sometimes you might have been a mission church, but maybe that area is growing a lot. So you need to build a church. A lot of people can't necessarily always raise the money all at one time to build a church. So sometimes they have to do, 2 campaigns to get there. So that's kind of more unusual, but it does happen. And even same kind of thing, you might have a master plan that everybody knows about. And we've done phases 1 through 4 in this campaign, and everyone's excited to do phases 5 through 8, in a couple of years, because they all took part in that planning process. We have another question from Peter in terms of plan giving to fund an endowment as well as capital campaigns and needs. We chose to focus on the kind of capital needs at St. Andrews because they were relatively significant. And I know that Jimmy's thinking about how can we start using some of this goodwill as we do these projects to kind of seed that endowment and build that out. CCS just finished working with St. Paul's in Cleveland Heights. So everything we work with everybody in the Heights, no matter whether it's in Cleveland or in Texas. But they just finished doing a campaign. They're wrapping up this week and next week. But their campaign was sort of a $5 million campaign initially, and it was going to be roughly $3 million in sort of capital needs and programs, and another $2 million in endowment. They'll probably end up through some planned gifts and things that they've gotten. They've probably gotten close to $1 million or so in terms of planned giving kind of money that's going to go into their endowment. So you can do one of those things, and more we're seeing folks do those types of campaigns, or even post campaign after they've done the capital projects, do the planned giving work, because as you would expect, some of those things just take some time. So if I have a conversation with Jimmy and his family and they're open to it, it's just going to take some time for them to talk to their attorney or planner and put some of those things into place. So people are willing to do it, but it just takes some steps. So that's another thing that I think a lot of churches can do is also try to identify, for example, is the church in their estate already? The thing that we do find out, I think it's something like close to 80% or so of like all estate gifts, the nonprofit finds out about it when the attorney calls and says, "Hey, Jimmy, hi, I'm Luke Driscoll. I'm an attorney for, John Smith. John passed away and he left money in his estate for you." And that's usually the first time that the organization hears about it. So in many cases, folks do this, but they don't always stop to think about notifying the church. So sometimes even having things like a legacy society, or whatever you want to call the name of it, but people who have put the church in their estate. And that can be something that you build out through the vestry and through other folks. Thank people, recognize the people who've done that. All endowments started humbly, but the idea is they build and they build. And it's, people's estate gifts, you don't have, that's not necessarily the purview of the super rich or anything. A lot of us, we have our homes and other things. So, a lot of folks can make some very lovely gifts to the church, and let the church know, hey, you're in my plans. So that's something that we encourage doing. Jimmy, have you had any comments or thoughts from folks in terms of like an appetite for kind of plan giving now? We're sort of after the campaign and we're doing these things, that folks are asking about that or wondering?
Not so much yet. Although there is a lot of conversation around our finance committees about the creation of the endowment, as you alluded to earlier, and I think part and parcel with that will be a planned giving component. I saw one of the questions come through about getting pushback about doing a capital campaign if attendance is down, or if attendance is not back to maybe what it was pre-pandemic. And I just want to say I went through all of that here and heard a lot and heard questions about that, concerns, and where our vestry came down to when they decided to do the campaign was they decided, they said, yes, not everybody's back yet, but maybe everybody won't be coming back, and maybe this is who we have now is who we have, and they saw the campaign as a way of they articulated it almost as an expression of outreach, that this is how we're reaching out to people in our congregation, that the church is continuing to be vital. The church continues to have a pulse even during COVID, and this is what we're doing, and we invite you to come join us and be part of this really exciting work, and that brought some people back that weren't here. So the question about pushback, what I would say is there will always be a reason to push back. There will always be a reason to push back, and the question to really discern is what is the reason to move forward, and is that reason more compelling than the reason to not?
And we're working with a church in Memphis right now that had done, a couple campaigns over the past 10 years. And so they really completely redeveloped their campus. they're a pretty decent sized church. They're bigger than St. Andrews, but not huge. But they have lots of buildings and things like that. There's a school on their campus too. So it's a very busy place. It gets used a lot. So they kind of had done some significant campaigns, and probably over the course of like a 5-year window, maybe raised around $10 million total. So they did all these different projects that they needed to do. But they also realized for a really, pretty big plant, they didn't have a very big endowment. They only had about a $2.5 or $3 million endowment, even though they had this pretty huge plant and a lot of people using the campus regularly. So they just started doing some kind of soft, plan giving and estate giving efforts. And they started out with a simple survey where they surveyed everybody. I think it was I'm not even sure if it was a 5-question survey. I think we got it down to 4, where we asked, kind of people, have you ever thought about, putting the church in your estate planning, or, is the church in your estate planning? Would you let us know? Would you be open to learning more about this if we had some small gatherings? So we emailed that out to, I think, a little more than about 450 households. And out of that, I think we had about 150 responded. So pretty high percentage of folks responded to the email and the survey. And then we had about 15 people who said, no, the church actually is in my estate plans, but I didn't let you know. So there were 15, essentially gifts to the endowment that they just weren't aware of yet. So they were able to document those. And in some cases, they were finding out even what the amounts were, because some cases were percentages and some cases were amounts. And then there was about another 75 or 80 people who kind of self-indicated, I'd love to hear more about this. And so we had, I think, 2 sessions at people's homes, and we had 1 session at the church. And so I think out of those 80 people, I think about another 40 or 50 came to one of those sessions. So again, even an exercise like that, that's not a heavy lift, identified 10 or 15 folks that, said, yes, we're going to give to the endowment, got another, probably 50 or so folks actively thinking about it. And then there's, another 300 plus that were kind of cultivated to have that conversation. So again, you can do some of these things with not a lot of kind of volunteer firepower. You don't necessarily need to do that. And a lot of times you might have some very talented people in your congregation who could be, again, objective advisors to say, hey, here's why making a gift like this is helpful. So I encourage you both, just want to look at the clock here and be thoughtful of everyone's time. A couple things in terms of lessons learned, and maybe Caitlin, you can kind of pull that up, last slide up here for everybody. What we learned, and we were sort of, we hoped that way and we thought that way, but the folks at St. Andrews are really generous, both in spirit, not just in giving, but in spirit. And I think people were received very warmly, and the volunteers all, and these were pretty busy, engaged people, like in different professional walks of life. We had a few folks that were retired, but it was a good cross section of people. But every single last one of them had said how much they enjoyed it, in terms of the outreach that Jimmy talked about. Folks had a chance to come together. Also physically coming together, where we had a couple different gatherings at people's homes, and I think we had one at one of the restaurants too. One of the members has a kind of a bar restaurant where folks gathered there. And then I think the last thing we learned too is just communications from beginning to end, from sort of the planning process that, notionally we're thinking this is the right thing to do, but what do you think? This is your congregation. And so having that kind of buy-in was helpful, because people understood their voice was being heard. We were being as transparent as possible wherever we could be with information as we had it. And that, we had the best interests of the congregation at heart. We're doing these things, as Jimmy talked about, we're trying to address these things before they fail, or before they break, before they go wrong, or someone gets hurt because, we don't have a way for somebody who's, doesn't have easy use of their legs to get into some place, that we can do all the types of things that makes it a welcoming place. So I think these were just some of the key lessons learned in this. Maybe Jimmy, a final thought from you, just with your experience, and share with everybody.
Final thought would be that it was a real defining moment for the congregation. and has really, I think, sort of propelled the congregation to a different capacity of thinking about itself, and thinking, that we can do hard things, we can do challenging things. It's worthwhile to do challenging things. We can grow through doing it, and that's what we're called to do. So it was really wonderful seeing the congregation faithfully step into that.
Great. Thanks, Jimmy. It was wonderful working with you and your staff and all your vestry and your volunteers. So it's just great. So we'll share all this information with everybody. If you go to the last slide, Caitlin, here's our info to both Jimmy and mine. So if you have any specific questions for either of us, happy to, answer them, point you in the right direction too. That's the other great thing I think about EPN is you meet other people through these types of things, and everybody has sort of, we all like to think we're different and unique, but a lot of our communities have a lot of similarities to each other that I'd encourage you, we can learn more from each other. So thanks again. And we also want to thank our friends at EPN and especially Joe Swimmer. Thanks for giving Jimmy and I a chance to talk today. So I hope everybody has a good rest of the day and a good week.